welcome to this special conversation on ORF. The COVID pandemic has probably been one of the biggest global health disasters that we have lived through in our lifetimes. Not just a global pandemic, it has had deep economic repercussions and has triggered perhaps a deep economic crisis as well. Through the course of this series, that's something we're going to discuss, the various nuances of it, and more importantly, how we make a path for ourselves out of it. Joining me to talk about that are two gentlemen who've been economy watchers for a long time. Mihir Sharma, who's an economist, a writer, and senior fellow at ORF, and Vivek Kaul, author of the book Bad Money, that basically traced through the last global financial crisis, and of course, a long-term economy watcher, as I said. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining in. Mihir, let me set the ball rolling with you, and then I can get Vivek in as well. Are there any lessons that seem apparent or clear already from the economic gridlock that we've gotten ourselves into because of COVID?
I think that it's important to recognize that there are three ways that we need to think about, three phases, as it were, of how this crisis is going to play out in the economic domain. The first is what began to happen in about February this year, which was when you saw with the China shutdown, subsequently with a lot of people cancelling orders for textile exports from India and so on and so forth, a sort of quick collapse in world trade, which will both impact production domestically and demand domestically. So it means that your exports are lower, but it also means that you're not able to produce things that require, upstream required inputs from China. So that was step one. Step two is now what we're going through at the moment, which is the consequences of the lockdown. So in order to control the virus, you've sort of put the economy in the deep freeze. And that is having consequences on companies, on smaller enterprises in particular, and on individual finances, right? And finally, I think we have to think very hard about what happens 2 weeks, 2 months, and 6 months down the line, when you are going to see the kind of contraction that we've already seen in China, which is months ahead of us, which is in China, if you believe the numbers, a contraction of 7%. So the GDP has fallen 7% in the quarter. In India, it may be higher, maybe lower, we don't know. But there's definitely going to be a very large impact on production and incomes going forward. And we have to deal with, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that.
Vivek, it's also a bit of a multi-step problem because it's not just an impact that, the entire economy takes, there's layers to it. Let me, nuance the question I posed to Mihir for you, which is how do you see this playing out for large businesses and industries that really do, contribute a lot to the manufacturing side versus the other pocket, which is the MSMEs, which at what we know at this point seem completely bludgeoned by this episode. Vivek.
Yeah. So, I guess, large businesses, at least, I mean, not all of them, but some of them do have the cash to ride through this period of 3 months or maybe even 6 months. But as far as MSMEs are concerned, they have been in, deep problems ever since demonetization and the botched up implementation of GST. So this was basically, the final sort of nail in nail in their coffin, and so unless we sort of take a few steps and take them very, very quickly, a lot of MSMEs are simply going to die. I mean, I don't see them really coming out of this.
Mir, you made the point about China. I think that's another question that India economy watchers are asking as we plan our exit out of this entire forced lockdown globally as well. Who is it that we should be comparing or benchmarking ourselves with? Should we be looking towards the US and what they've done? Should we be looking towards the Asian construct? Who are our benchmarkable peers in this economic revival?
The sad fact is that India, typically, you can't get a lot of, you can't really take that many lessons from elsewhere. And it's a product of the kind of country that we are. We are a very large economy. We are not necessarily as embedded in world trade as a lot of others. we are a buyer of oil, not a seller of commodities overall. So, we can't recover. We don't do well if, for example, the commodity price cycle recovers. We don't have the state capacity that China has. We don't have the resources that a lot of OECD first world countries have. And, it's in many ways, India is sui generis, and we will have to work out exactly what is right for us. What is therefore, I think we should take from that assumption is that we shouldn't be quick to try and replicate the economic packages that other people are trying. So for example, you constantly hear someone saying, okay, if the US spends 10% of their GDP on recovering the economy, why don't we, right? And the answer is that for us, it might have a different impact. It might have a different distributional impact. Money, you spend 10% of your economy, but it may all go to the largest companies that can already survive, right? And the trickle-down effect of that may not be very large. Other countries may be able to spend 10% because their future borrowing would not be impacted to the degree that ours would. All right, so we don't know what's the if there's a benchmark that we can look at, but we definitely know that we can't pick up any of these other solutions that are being bandied about and say, yes, that's what we need to do here.
Vivek, you want to come in on that? A staggered versus bazooka approach? Yeah.
I agree with Mihir totally on this. And I mean, I find a lot of people, and especially these stock market wallahs, who want a lot of money printing to happen, and you know how that goes. So, the point here is that we need to realize that one is that rupee is not an international reserve currency, right? Like the dollar is. Dollar is also, a safe haven, and it has always had an exorbitant privilege, which the rupee doesn't. So there is a great threat, and if we were to sort of go overboard borrowing or even print money, there's a great threat of being downgraded. The rating agencies might downgrade us, rupee might go for a free fall, long-term interest rates will shoot up, and we will end up in a much bigger mess than we currently are in. Having said that, also typically what happens is, and especially on the social media, is people like these solutions. Everybody wants a solution. The problem is sometimes there is no solution, because if you look at our fiscal capacity right now, or the ability of the government to spend its way out of the crisis, it's simply not there. If you look at the actual fiscal deficit, which is the central government deficit plus the state government deficit plus the off-budget borrowing plus whatever the public sector is borrowing, it's close to 9.5% of the GDP. And now with the tax collections collapsing, this might just shoot up to 15-16%. So it's like, either ways, it's a problem which really doesn't have a simple, straightforward solution. You have to basically pick up one side and then go with it. So.
A bit of a rock and a hard place. Vivek, just as an extension though, it seems like our favored path has been monetary rather than fiscal. Do you agree with that approach? Do you think that's the one to take for a country like ours?
I've said this more than a few times in the past few years. Monetary policy in India has been dead for a while. And the sooner people realize this, the better it is. Now, if you look at what the entire, what Mr. Das said yesterday, and banks have liquidity of close to 7 lakh crore, and they are not willing to lend. And it's perfectly, it makes perfect sense, because, the bad loan rate is close to 9.3%. In case of public sector banks, it's 12.7%. Now, a bank which already has, a bad loan rate in the double digits, why would they want to lend at this point of time with so much uncertainty? It makes perfect sense for them to just keep parking all their money through the reverse repo window and just hope for the best. So,
Mihir, you want to come in on that? Because this credit market problem is not something that we have inherited with COVID. It's something we've been struggling with since IL&FS, and that as well seems to be a large part of the problem when we do emerge from the lockdown. The fact that the credit market is completely frozen.
I think we have to go back beyond IL&FS. Essentially, what we're doing, we're seeing right now is that the stimulus for the last crisis, we forgot to, unwind and settle. We are dealing with, in many ways, the debt overhang from all the credit that we rolled out as part of the sort of emergency response after 2008. And because that a lot of that debt is still on the books of the banks, they are not available to play the saviors for the economy that, in fact, a lot of banks are doing in other parts of the world. So the US can turn to their banks and say, look, we're going to rely on you to start lending to small businesses. If we turn to our banks, they're going to say two things. They're going to say, first, I still have a lot of my debt sitting on my books from the last time I worked for you. All right. And B, I've got 15 other things that you've already given me to do because I'm a public sector bank. Right. And you're completely snowed under with all these government mandates. And in a crisis, you have no time for another. And the truth is, on this sort of monetary fiscal thing, nobody has sat down and tried to made it explicit the fact that because after 2008, a lot of countries had a fairly strong monetary response rather than a fiscal response, as well as a fiscal response in some cases, but in many cases, the monetary response dominated. You had very, very unpleasant consequences of this for the income distribution. All right. The monetary response helps certain people, groups, companies that may already be better off. And we have to accept this. A monetary response is not as accountable as a fiscal response. You don't know who has benefited from, for example, the RBI buying, saying that it will back another 50,000 crores of long-term, of targeted LTROs, targeted underwriting of the corporate bond market. We don't know right now, we can find out, but we don't right now know eventually who will benefit. And the chances are it's going to be the best of companies, the best of promoters, or at least the most creditworthy companies and promoters. All right. Now, if that was done through a fiscal mechanism, if we had backed the same people, which is fine, maybe we think that it's important in order to keep the economy going, but had that been done through a fiscal mechanism, it would have been accountable. We would have known who was benefiting. This way, we don't even know who's benefiting. So politically down the road, there are going to be consequences of this, and we have to keep those in mind right now.
Mm. Vivek, the other problem that we have been struggling with, aside from what's happening on this larger macro picture, it's what's happening at an individual level. So let's whittle it down to that. We were staring at extremely high unemployment figures in any case, especially in urban India, especially for the educated youth, and that's really going to explode now. We know of layoffs, we know of salary cuts, of course. How do you think this is going to start translating into an individual level impact?
So I was just checking the CMI unemployment numbers, before we got online, and for April, as of April 12th, it's at 24%. So it's close to 1/4 of the labor force being unemployed. But the interesting thing is, and this is something that nobody really points out, is that the labor force participation rate has fallen from around 42-43% to around 35-36%. So fewer people are looking for jobs, and within that, your rate of unemployment has just shot up. So effectively, the rate of unemployment is higher than 24%. Now, how will it translate into, at the individual level? I mean, the example that I would like to use is of the Great Depression. Now, during the Great Depression, around 25% of the American labor force was unemployed. Around 13 million Americans were unemployed. Now, but the impact that it had on consumption was significantly more. So to give you an example, between 1929 and 1933, the sales of Ford Motor Company, which was by far the biggest car company in US at that point of time, fell by 86%. Okay. Now, what was happening there? What was happening there was very interesting. What was happening was that even people who had not been fired started cutting down on their consumption. And this is a very psychological thing. When 25% of the population is unemployed, all of us would know someone who is unemployed. and we start planning for that unemployment. What if I were to get unemployed, right? So you sort of start cutting down on your consumption, and that again has an impact, at an overall level. It has an impact on incomes, and then more people get fired, and then, so the cycle goes. So the psychology of a slowdown is, if we were to call this, this is like much more than a slowdown. So the psychology of a recession is much more dangerous than the recession itself. And that will creep in very, very, in fact, it's already creeping in. Obviously, the evidence as of now is anecdotal, but I think the April end numbers will obviously be bad, but the May end numbers, assuming the lockdown ends on May 4th, will tell us a lot about this psychology that I'm talking.
You've written, of course, about this on social media as well, Vivek, including handy tips like being nice to your family, which I think is something to keep in mind. Mihir, I just want to talk a little bit about this and take it on a different tangent. The other outcome or expected outcome of this is that you start looking inwards for a lot of industries. For example, pharmaceuticals or things that you think are essential for you as a nation, you start pulling out from others where you had perhaps raw material agreements with, and you start bringing those businesses home. Is there a chance that just like we suddenly built a BPO industry for us, there are going to be new layers that may develop within this economy that might again present employment opportunities?
Well, of course, it's entirely possible that if for some reason this is the spark that causes globalization to go into full-fledged retreats, then yes, there's going to be some, in the medium term, some, growth industries, things that will replace, substitute what we used to get as imports. Overall, however, that would be, I think, a fairly bad thing in terms of employment. It would definitely be, just look at it right now. A lot of people are saying, we are dependent upon China, let's say, for APIs, which is the active ingredient for many of the medicines that are required. And therefore, we should be producing them here. That may be correct. You should have something, if you determine that it is important for national security, you should have a certain minimum productivity here. But we're also dependent on the outside world for PPEs, personal protective equipment. We're dependent on the outside world for ventilators. And that's what we know we'll need right now. Could we have predicted that we would need these from the outside world 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago? No. The point of having a globalized world with a lot of trade between a lot of different places is that this kind of thing can in fact be sourced from anywhere and move to anywhere. The danger is precisely when countries decide that I'm going through a crisis, I shut down exports, because that means that the system is not playing itself out properly. Anyone should be able to get what they want from anywhere, which means that when China needed masks in January, it was able to get masks from the world. Today, if we need masks, we should be able to get masks from China, right? So that as the demand for these various things, and in the future it'll be other things, goes up, goes down in different countries, they should be able to trade with each other. I don't think that we're going to be able to see a retreat in globalization as a good thing for India in the long term. We may be able to say that some people will question the degree to which they are dependent upon China in particular. Right? So China has dominated global supply chains in a way that may become dangerous, and maybe we can take advantage of that if we're smart, if we're quick. But that's a different issue from trying to substitute all the imports we get from the world.
Sure. Vivek, I want to touch upon another point that you made, with regards to an individual impact. What has happened so far is that on the consumption side, what helped services up was that there was still quite a bit of spending on categories like travel, hospitality, tourism, and that's the space that's really taken a body blow through this entire lockdown. How do you see those trends emerging when we come out of this?
I think, to use a cliche, only time will sort of heal these sectors, because see, until the idea of social distancing stays in our heads, I don't see people even going back to cinema halls very quickly. So if you see the way Bollywood is talking, or rather the Hindi film industry is talking now, I mean, so all the big releases which have been postponed will not get released immediately after the lockdown ends. I mean, they are planning to release these movies 6-7 months down the line so that people get back into the habit of watching movies. Or to take something as simple as, going to your barber. I find that idea very, very dangerous. I mean, you don't know how many people he's been in touch with all through the day, and you don't. I mean, it's just very. So I mean, so if you take all these things into account, it's not. I don't see the tourism sector or hotels. Business travel obviously might revive, but traveling for pleasure will take its time to revive.
Okay, completely out of time. So quick final words from both you gentlemen. I know I'm asking you to stick your necks out, but Mihir, from where we stand at this point, how long do you think digging ourselves out of this entire pit is going to take?
I think that we have to recognize that until a vaccine is found and delivered to a vast majority of the world's population, we are in a very special time. So we can't expect a recovery. We should stop looking at growth numbers. We should stop looking at GDP numbers. We need to make sure that good companies don't die and people don't die. We're in a holding phase. This is not a regular economy, not a regular world at all. That's what a pandemic is. So please, let's not pretend that it's anything other than the kind of crisis that we just have to deal with by shutting ourselves down for a bit.
You know, Mihir, how they're dividing time into before COVID and after COVID. So I like your concept of VST, very special time. Vivek, how long will very special time take?
I don't know. I mean that I guess only public health professionals can tell us. But I mean, assuming things turn around on May 4th. Okay. I mean, I'm obviously making this assumption, and it's not a good one. I think it will still take us at least a year, if at all, to get back on track. Because I mean, simply to put it very simply, if things sort of end, I mean, the lockdown ends on May 4th, you still have 5 weeks of the year have essentially gone down the drain, and the impact of that will linger for a while. So essentially, so in Hindi we say mota mota. So mota mota agar pakde to 10% to 15% of the economy for this year will get destroyed. So to turn that around will at least take us more than a year, probably 16 to 18 months.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for that. I think it was an extremely balanced yet forthright conversation, and I think it set the tone for tracking our way from here. Thank you very much again for your time today.